Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, new year, but same old fears about a slowdown in China shake global financial markets. Find out what's going on with the world's #2 economy. Also this week, what Brazil's new president Jair Bolsonaro wants to do to transform Latin America's biggest economy. And taxing times for technology giants, a new law came into effect in France, and Apple has issued a rare revenue warning. The China-US trade war is on countdown and the world is watching. Remember, both sides agreed to a 90-day truce on December 1st. Well, that expires at the end of next month, and billions of dollars of penalties are still in place. For many economists, what happens next will prove to be the key factor deciding the outlook for Asia's economy in 2019. As the new year gets underway, alarm bells are already sounding about a slowdown in the world's second biggest economy and exporting nation. China's CSI 300 index lost around a quarter of its value in 2018. Manufacturing orders fell in December. The fear is that the impact of a trade war is likely to be felt this year, and it could mean weaker growth in countries dependent upon trade with China. It's making global investors jumpy about what's in store for the new year. As Rob Reynolds reports now from Washington, D.C.
Stock markets swinging wildly. A bruising global trade war and slowing growth worldwide. So what's in store for 2019? Veteran forecaster Lakshmana Chuthan studies leading economic indicators. He says slowdowns are part of capitalism.
Upswings and downswings, accelerations and decelerations are inevitable. That's part and parcel of a market-oriented economy.
But that cyclical slowdown is worsened by policy decisions, particularly the Trump administration's tariffs on foreign steel, aluminum, and an array of goods made in China. Trump also rattled investors with unprecedented criticism of the Federal Reserve, the nominally independent U.S. central bank.
It's really been a 1-2 punch. Cycle slowdown first, then the trade sanctions, trade war rhetoric, whatever you want to call it. And the question right now is, are we ready, or what is the next punch going to be, and are we ready for it?
In December, General Motors said it would close 5 plants and lay off thousands of workers, in part due to soaring steel costs. Companies large and small are scaling back plans for 2019. Los Angeles businessman Tommy Yip sells toys made in China.
I had the initial thought to start store 2 next year, but that may be back to the drawing board.
Germany, Sweden, Italy, Switzerland, Russia, and other developed countries have all had negative growth for at least 1 quarter, and China is clearly in a significant slowdown. As for the U.S.,
the U.S. is not in imminent risk of a recession, but we're continuing to slow, and the longer we slow, the sharper the slowdown, the closer we get to recession risk.
Consumer spending is still strong. U.S. shoppers bought more than $850 billion worth of goods in the 2018 holiday season. It's always possible to remain optimistic and hope that policymakers make wise decisions and that the global economy doesn't tip into recession. On the other hand,
the optimist who jumped off the Empire State Building, you know what he said on the way down, so far so good.
So buckle up. 2019 could be one bumpy ride.
Joining us now from Hong Kong is Jim McCafferty. Jim's the head of equity research Asia and Japan at Nomura Holdings. Jim, good to have you with us on Counting the Cost. So what's going on with the world's #2 economy? Does the future still belong to China?
Well, I think what we're seeing is that GDP growth forecasts are coming down for China as the world's second biggest economy, and a lot of the metrics coming through over the last couple of days are signaling that the health of the economy really deteriorated during the fourth quarter. Now, having said all that, China's economy is still growing. It's still the second biggest economy globally, and it's growing at, let's say, more than 6% a year, which relative to big economies in the world is still a huge pace of growth. But nonetheless, the growth of that economy is slowing down, and for global investors, they find that quite hard to digest.
Just how important is China's growth for the wider Asia region and indeed its equity markets?
Okay, so I guess in the context of Asia Pacific, right now Japan is by far and away the single biggest market. It's 40% of Asia Pacific. That will change over the coming years as China's economy and China's stock market is reweighted by those index providers. And what we expect to see happening is that by 2023, China will eclipse Japan as the single biggest equity market in the region. Now, that means that investors over here and elsewhere around the world who've traditionally seen Asia Pacific as divided into two categories, Japan as a developed market and Asia ex-Japan, China being the biggest of those Asia ex-Japan markets, being morphed into one single asset class. And that means in years to come, we may look at Asia Pacific as China, one single market, and then Asia ex-China as a separate market.
Jim, what does all of that mean to people like you and me and anyone watching?
Well, what it means is that China as an economy is the second biggest in the world, and it's 15% of the global economic output. But in terms of stock market, it's only 3% of the overall stock market representation. So what it means is that China's stock market needs to catch up with its economy, and companies will become more sophisticated in the way they deal with investors. Foreigners who previously really stayed on the sidelines with the China market, they have to come in, given the scale of these companies, which are not just domestic companies, but becoming increasingly international over the last few years. So I would expect that the big global investors who encourage retail investors to buy these global funds, which are primarily US and European funds, they're going to have to start taking Asia much more seriously.
You sound pretty bullish, particularly on China, Jim, if you don't mind my saying so. Are you being perhaps a little overconfident here, given the geopolitical situation, the trade spat between the US and China that rumbles on?
I think from the perspective of trade, and we've been doing a bit of work on this, then I'm thinking that Trump and Xi both care about the value of the stock market. From Trump's perspective, a lot of his voters, a lot of the guys who got him into power, they care about their 401ks, they care about their pension plans, and weakness in the US equity market we've seen in the last quarter doesn't like Trump's policy with regard to trade. At the same time, from Xi's perspective, although he's got absolute control, it's very useful for him to have social cohesion. And from a China market point of view, this is not a market that's owned by sophisticated institutional investors, it's owned by retail investors. So if the Chinese authorities and if the US authorities are able to send signals that actually stimulate the stock market as well as the wider economy, that will be welcome, I think.
A very happy new year to you, Jim. Many thanks indeed for being with us on Counting the Cost.
You too.
Well, the head of Apple has partly blamed the US president's trade war with China for missing out on billions of dollars worth of business. Tim Cook warned of lower than expected earnings for the first quarter of this year, also citing weaker demand from China. Heidi Jo Castro reports.
This is iPhone 10.
When a confident Tim Cook announced the launch of Apple's iPhone 10 in September, the fanfare couldn't mask the risk his company was taking. Would enough consumers across the globe be willing to pay the $1,000 price tag of the latest and greatest iPhone? And now the answer, likely not. Apple revised its revenue forecast for the first quarter, lowering it by up to $9 billion. And Cook says it's due to weak iPhone sales in China.
It's clear that the economy began to slow there for the second half. And what I believe to be the case is the trade tensions between the United States and China put additional pressure on their economy.
The U.S. is charging a 10% tariff on $200 billion of Chinese imports, and China has responded in kind to $60 billion of products shipped from the U.S. Within 2 months, the U.S. tariff on China will escalate to 25% if the two countries don't come to an agreement.
I respect China and I respect President Xi, but they've been killing us. $507 billion in trade deficits last year. 507.
Apple's losses have pulled down global markets, which may further harm China's weakened economy, which only means more losses for U.S. companies that do business there. Chinese consumers have responded by turning inward, choosing cheaper domestic brands over U.S. luxury goods from Apple.
Mainly because the quality of phones from China's local brands have become better and better. Their market shares are rising.
The homegrown Huawei dominates the smartphone market in China. Its chief financial officer was arrested in Canada last month, accused of violating U.S. sanctions in her business dealings. That stirred anger among Chinese consumers, giving them still more reason to support Huawei and boycott Apple.
We still have a possible 60-day window for them to come to some sort of temporary agreement. I think, if anything, the trade war is bringing tensions that we already saw between the U.S. and China economically to the fore.
Trade talks between the U.S. and China are set to resume in Beijing this week.
Still to come on Counting the Cost, a place in the sun, why non-Europeans are snapping up property in Greece. But first, tech giants in France now have to pay more tax. The so-called GAFA tax, named after Google, Apple, Facebook and Amazon, is to ensure global digital firms pay their fair share. The measure is expected to raise around $570 million for France in 2019. The French government had been pushing for an EU-wide levy, but failed to get the required support. Earlier, we spoke to technologist and coder Aral Balkan, who says that it won't financially hurt tech giant companies like Facebook to pay more taxes.
If Facebook was to pay the entirety of the tax that France wants to levy, that would take them about 4 days of earnings right now. So we're not really talking about anything that's going to make a huge dent, but this is a power play. So really, it again remains to be seen where the actual power lies here. And I think it's in our interest as individuals and citizens that our democratically elected governments can keep these multinational tech companies in check.
Economists are warning that bad debt and low savings are threatening the survival of Nigeria's commercial banks. Many people refuse to put their money in accounts, saying that banks can't be trusted. Ahmed Idris reports.
Zayano Gidambango farms and sells onions to some Nigeria's neighbors. At the peak of the season, he makes about $30,000 a week. Despite this income, he stopped taking his money to the bank.
I'm not satisfied with the services I receive. I used to have an account, but I was disappointed several times. So I now put my earnings back into the business and invest in real estate.
And millions of other Nigerians are either not putting their money into savings accounts or have never even set foot in a bank. Economists blame a number of factors, including low income and poverty. But even some of the rich are looking elsewhere to take their money.
If you look at the investment opportunities that are available, especially outside Nigeria, and the relatively high earnings associated with investment in such ventures, it becomes a less incentive for them to save in the country relative to investing outside. But importantly, the savings culture must be institutionalized by the government itself.
With many banks going out of business during the last decade, economists say better supervision and enforcement is needed to attract the savings and investments the banking system relies on.
For any financial institutions to go into distress in terms of the high proportion of its total risk asset being taken away and being converted into bad loan, it indicates that the surveillance system provided by Central Bank of Nigeria and Nigerian Deposit Insurance Corporation is either inadequate or low, or there is a deliberate connivance on the part of the regulatory authorities.
Banks are becoming leaner with fewer branches and staff, and acquisitions and mergers are also becoming the norm. A bank used to be here. Someone else is renting the building now. After decades of doing business, the bank shut down because it didn't have enough customers. Many people are poor and don't have enough to put in a savings account. Another factor is the distrust of the banking system. Small businessmen like Zayano want more from the banks. Access not only to loans, but better returns on their savings too. If that's not provided, the banks may find the number of customers contributing to savings accounts dwindling further.
Brazil's new president, Jair Bolsonaro, was sworn in as the new year got underway. He's already given powers to the Agriculture Ministry to manage the Amazon rainforest. John Holman reports from Brasilia.
Now his president, Jair Bolsonaro, can begin making good on his election promises. He'll face some big challenges. Crime is number one. More than 60,000 Brazilians were killed in 2017 alone. Bolsonaro's solution, giving more people access to guns and police more license to kill.
Citizens deserve to have ways to defend themselves. We'll honor and respect those who sacrifice their lives for safety.
But Brazilian officers already kill thousands, most of them young and black. It's been questioned if an even harder line will work. Less controversial, but just as challenging, is Bolsonaro's aim to curb corruption. He's brought in Sergio Moro, the man in charge of Latin America's biggest bribery investigation, as his justice minister, but it may be tougher than he thinks.
This fight against corruption is much more easier in terms of electoral narrative than in terms of practice. And the government has, besides the fact of the strong will of the president to fight against corruption, the necessity to establish a lot of political alliances to guide a governative agenda.
And then there's the economy. 12 million Brazilians are unemployed. Bolsonaro says that free market economics and small government will fix that.
The government won't spend more than comes in.
But if he really wants to balance the books, he'll have to make cuts to Brazil's generous pension system. It takes up more than half the federal budget. That would be deeply unpopular. How far President Bolsonaro gets in responding to all of those challenges is going to be decided here in Brasilia, where his party has only about 1/10 of the seats in the Houses of Congress. So he's going to have to negotiate with all those that backed him, and that includes ex-generals, evangelicals, agro-business leaders, and the financial sector if he wants to get anything done. And everyone will want to say.
These groups, they are really willing to fight each other. So I'd say that the challenge is how to put these groups together and how to align expectations so that these groups become part of a government and not fragments.
President Bolsonaro ran a successful campaign on the errors and abuses of Brazil's left-of-centre governments. Now it's the time of the man from the right to see if he can do better.
Well, joining us now from London, Richard Segal. Richard's a senior emerging markets analyst with Manulife Asset Management. Good to have you with us once again, Richard. So what are the challenges facing Bolsonaro as he takes office?
The focus is clearly going to be on fiscal consolidation from a number of fronts, economic liberalization, but also a streamlining of the economy and the public sector workforce. It's important to realize how enormous the challenges are, though, and therefore we'll be looking for this new government to be making step-by-step progress with only a few steps backwards, rather than a big bang approach, which would have the risk of failing.
But this is a man, by his own admission, who knows very little about the markets and how the financial world works. Has he got the wherewithal to do what Brazil needs?
Thus far, it's been quite encouraging to read one after another the appointments he's made to steer the economy. First, academics in the position of finance minister, but also a long-standing financial markets professional to run the central bank. The risk here is that where there are setbacks, these individuals might resign or be forced out, and therefore we would be back to the drawing board. But thus far, President Bolsonaro has indicated that he will adopt a hands-off approach towards letting the experts run the economy and the financial markets. And so therefore there is reason to be encouraged, but with many Latin countries, the initial appointments have been welcomed, but they haven't lasted long enough. So once again, we have to hold our breath and hope for the best.
He says he's going to stamp out Brazil's endemic corruption. its bureaucracy. What's it going to take to get foreign direct investments? What is it going to take to get those of us looking into Brazil from the outside to put our money into the country?
A lot has actually been done in the past several years. The car wash scandal helped to root out a lot of the larger scale corruption. So I would say that the more important challenges as we look into 2019 into 2020 are to focus on the bureaucracy rather than the corruption. Because of the scandals of the past couple of years, those politicians who might be inclined to go back to the old ways will be afraid of being taped or be afraid of finding themselves on the front pages for the wrong reasons. So that's less of a worry. However, Brazil's public sector bureaucracy is bloated across the board, left to right, up and down. I think there what we need is an effort to reduce the size of the public sector workforce. It's going to take a long time, but it has been delayed for many years, and they have to start somehow.
Richard, really good to talk to you. Many thanks indeed for being with us on Counting the Cost.
Thank you.
And finally this week, a record 33 million visitors are heading to Greece every year, and they're driving up previously depressed house prices. Non-Europeans are among the buyers. If they spend enough, they get a visa to stay. Al Jazeera's John Soropoulos reports from Athens.
Andonis Tsaousis has just sold this one-bedroom apartment to a Chinese investor. It has a panoramic view of Athens, but until last year, the owners would have been lucky to get half the price it fetched, $280,000. That's the minimum investment required for a Greek golden visa, which allows non-Europeans to live in Europe. It's the cheapest such visa in the European Union, and it's brought a flood of new money into a depressed real estate market.
The main priority for people who buy these properties is to secure the golden visa and freedom to travel in Europe. They see it as a cheap investment in a property they intend to rent out.
Half of all golden visas in Greece go to Chinese nationals. Chinese companies have set up shop here to renovate and manage their properties. Foreign money is a bonanza for estate agents like Tsaousis, who've seen their business jump by more than 50% in a year. And tourism is part of that bonanza. Short-term rentals are booming in central Athens, and boutique hotels are springing up. During the past decade, house construction and house sales have fallen by 90%. That has wiped $3 billion off the tax revenues that are raised when property changes hands. So governments introduced the highest taxes in the European Union on property ownership. Anyone with real estate must pay to keep it, and failure to do so means the government may seize it and their bank accounts. Greeks are being forced to sell the property they spent generations building to meet tax obligations. The head of the Hellenic Property Federation, which represents owners, met Greece's creditors when the property tax was introduced.
Creditors said that this was a tax Greeks must learn to pay because their real estate holdings are large compared to those of other Europeans. I don't think creditors understood that this tax goes against core values. The Greeks worked hard to build their property. They often had to go overseas. Nobody handed them this property.
The selling spree is also encouraged by banks, which are foreclosing on $12.5 billion worth of property that backs non-performing loans, and they've severely cut credit for new mortgages. So even though average property prices have fallen by 40% in the past decade, few Greeks are in any position to take advantage of opportunities.
And that is our show for this week. If you'd like to comment on anything that you've seen, please do get in touch with us. You can tweet me. I'm at @Finnegan on Twitter. Please use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or you could drop us a line. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our email address. As always, there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page, and there you'll find individual reports, links, even entire episodes for you to catch up on. But that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan from the whole team here in Doha. Thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.